I have a special place in my heart for Philadelphia, a city of sports fans and cheesesteaks, of history and higher learning. But like anywhere, there are also some places in this fine metropolis that should be avoided, like Eastern State Penitentiary. If you've been to Philly, you've probably seen it. Hard to miss. It's massive, all stone, with 30-foot silos guarding its entrance, and watchtowers along the wall beyond that. Looks more like a castle than a prison, actually. And I've heard there were some pretty medieval torture methods used there too. Extreme isolation, a water tank. Anyway, this sadistic house of justice was open for 142 years before shuttering in 1971. Now, it's a historical relic, sitting smack in the middle of this city I love. A reminder to follow the rules, because if you don't, an impenetrable cage awaits you. And once you're locked inside, it's unlikely you'll get a chance to leave, not even when you die. It doesn't sound like the kind of place one visits on purpose, but I did. Let me explain. Every year the prison does an event called Terror Behind the Walls. It's a haunted house, but also a party, which I was invited to, being a horror writer and all. So last Halloween, there I was, walking through its eerie stone walls, with a soundtrack of ghostly screams playing in the background. Every so often, an actor would leap out, get my pulse racing. It was cute. But the splashy show wasn't the most interesting thing I saw there. That honor went to a reedy, middle-aged security guard with bushy eyebrows. At first glance, he seemed nondescript, just a sentry, keeping an eye on the horror junkies. But then I saw him hurry off, in a way that piqued this incessant curiosity of mine. Maybe it's because he seemed nervous, like he was running away from something. No, that's not right. Towards something. Not that it made a difference. I'd come to find out your intended direction doesn't matter in a place like Eastern State Penitentiary. Because there's not one spot in this godforsaken hole that the dead can't find you. You're listening to Run Fool. I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 28, Eastern State Penitentiary. The guard I'd clocked had a name, Henry Gifford. And before I saw old Henry slink away from the crowds, he was at his assigned post in the rotunda, the room in the center of the prison, an echoey circular space the cell blocks connected to. I gotta tell you this up front. Henry was on parole, served some time for possession, and part of the deal was that he had to find a job. Some of you might be raising your eyebrows, because it's weird. A guy on parole taking a gig at a prison. I get it. But Henry needed the cash. See, he'd just found out he had a kid, a 5-year-old son he never knew about. And Henry knew he should step up to the plate. Otherwise, this boy would grow up without his deadbeat dad, just like Henry had. Which brings me to why Henry wanted this gig in particular. His old man had been a crook too, one of the baddest guys in Philly. Drug dealer, killer, thief, you name it. And he'd been a prisoner at Eastern State until it closed in the 70s. After that, no one knew what happened to him. He just vanished. He could have gotten transferred and lost in the prison system, or died, or escaped. Henry never knew the guy. He was locked up before Henry was out of diapers. But now, and this next part doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't have to. Emotions are funny that way. But now, Henry wanted to get some closure, find out who his dad really was, maybe even learn what became of him. He thought if he did that, he'd have a chance at being a father himself. Soon as the event got crowded enough, Henry quietly headed towards cell block 14. He'd studied the prison map during his training, and he knew where the inmate records were kept. It was an obvious first stop to learning more about his dad. The block itself was connected to the rotunda, where Henry was posted, like I said, so he didn't have to travel far. It was just a matter of making sure the people running the event didn't see him slip away. He didn't want to get fired before he had a chance to poke around. After making sure the coast was clear, he tiptoed through 14's stone archway into the darkness beyond. The gleeful screams of visitors faded as Henry stepped inside. The light did too. The haunting strobes from the event didn't reach in there. The darkness was too deep, too dense. A few wisps of the fog machine came in, though, danced around Henry like a couple of fun-loving ghosts. He snagged the event-issued flashlight from his hip, had some smiley-faced pumpkin on its side, clicked it on, waved the beam around. He was on the ground floor, which was lined with cells. Walkways loomed over him on either side, connected by a rusted grate. Above that, a long, narrow window was embedded in the ceiling. They say this place was designed like a church, with windows and skylights throughout, so the prisoners could feel the eyes of God watching their every move. Passing judgment, deciding who deserved a chance at redemption and who should rot. Henry headed towards the end of the corridor, where the record room was supposed to be. As he went, he felt his skin chill. The air here was thick with cold and must. It was almost suffocating. He thought about going back, but he couldn't leave. Being here where his dad had lived gave him butterflies. And Henry was thinking these nerves meant he was close to getting what he came for. A giggle came from the shadows, interrupting his thoughts. Then, a figure dashed across his flashlight's beam, disappeared into a cell just in front of him, too fast to see who it was or what they looked like. Henry froze. That was unexpected. His hand shook as he waved the flashlight into the cell, where the figure had gone. A skylight presided over a tiny stone-walled room. No sink, sort of a toilet, or rather a hole in the ground lined with some cracked porcelain. And there was a single rotting cot, with a face peering from under it. Henry watched, electrified with horror, as a pair of arms slowly reached out, covered in bloody pockmarks. A head emerged, hair wet with oil. The figure crawled from the bed and crept to the cell door. They rose up slowly, unfurling themselves in front of Henry in all their terrifying glory. And then they laughed. It took him a second to realize this thing was a young girl, and she was smirking at Henry like he was stupid. She was an actor. Henry recognized her from the team meeting before the event. Some annoying theater kid who'd raised her hand 1,000 times. The pockmarks, the oily hair, the dirt, all makeup. She sort of apologized to Henry then, but he could tell she didn't mean it. She was too deep in character for a genuine apology. She did offer an explanation, though. All the good spots on the haunted tour were taken, so she'd set out to find her own. Her excuse was, to put it nicely, idiotic. Guests weren't even allowed in the cell block. What was the point in hiding there? No one was going to pass by, but Henry didn't get a chance to tell her off. 'Cause suddenly, about 6 pairs of hands grabbed this girl from behind. Dirty, blistered fingers grasped her neck, her mouth, her limbs, then yanked her into the pitch blackness of the cell. The girl's screams were immediate and visceral, and they preceded a horrific string of noises, popping, sucking, ripping. This cacophony continued till the sound of her choking was cut off abruptly, and all was quiet. Henry's quivering legs didn't really obey him at that point. See, he was telling them to run, but you know how it is. Your body doesn't always do what your mind commands. And it was his body, not his mind, that decided to shine his flashlight into that cell, to see what appalling things had transpired there. A crowd of 10 men stood in the small room. They all wore the same white pinstripe pants and red shirts. Henry recognized the look from a historical photo in the building's lobby. Prison-issued uniforms. As Henry's light slid over the scene, the men looked up at him, one by one, faces weathered and somber. Now, I know what you're thinking. Henry's going to assume these are more actors, dressed up like prisoners, that this was all part of the terror behind the wall event. Nope, because these men stood around a lump on the floor. It was what remained of the theater kid. Her arms were twisted every which way. Shards of bone had ripped through the skin like teeth. Her neck hung at an angle. Henry couldn't even see where her legs were, probably ripped clean off. Considering she lay in a dense pool of viscous blood, prosthetics can be good, but they can't make a body look like that. Henry finally listened to what his head had been saying all along. He ran, fast as he could, sprinted down the hall to where he thought was the exit. But when he slowed his pace to look around, he realized he'd gone the wrong way. Up ahead, the corridor narrowed as it met 3 other hallways. 2 large mirrors lined the sides. Here's an interesting tidbit about these mirrors. Back in the day, they were installed so guards could see what awaited them before rounding a corner. You know, in case any prisoners had gotten out and were about to make the jump on them. It was another detail Henry learned during his training. He just never thought he'd have to use them. He raised his light and eyed the reflection as he approached, peered down one of the adjoining hallways. Clear. He moved the beam to the next mirror. A pair of piercing blue eyes met his, set in the face of a sallow-skinned man in a prison uniform. His pupils lit up like headlights from the flashlight's glare. The man opened his mouth as if trying to scream, but what came out was a low, croaking sound that set Henry's teeth on edge. Seconds later, a cluster of silhouettes appeared before this man. The killers from the cell had found him. They stood still for a moment, staring at Henry in the mirror. Henry stared at them, right back, and then they shot towards him in a full sprint. Henry booked it the other way. At this point, he didn't know where he was running to or from. He was all turned around, and the flashlight was barely making a dent in the pitch blackness of the prison. Up ahead, he saw an open room. Without giving it a second thought, he flew inside, slammed the door shut, and tried to catch his rasping, labored breath. He waited for fists to pound on the door, for men to try to get inside, but it was quiet, except for a steady drip from some unseen leaky pipe. He waved his flashlight around the space. Old dusty file cabinets took up a whole side of the room, set up in a haphazard way, like they'd been pushed over there or something. A typewriter set in the corner. A large clock hung on a wall. Henry had managed to flee right to the place he'd been looking for. He was in the records room. Funny how that works out. He immediately ran over to the cabinets, because curiosity is a powerful thing. Here we got Henry, who has a sadistic pack of killers chasing him, and he still wanted to find the prison records for his old man. He looked for the G cabinet and found his own last name inside, Gifford. It was a yellow curling folder, old, a little damp. When he flipped open the cover, he was devastated. It was unreadable. The ink had bled together, making the page one big swirl of blotchy black and white. He looked up at the wall, noticing the source of that drip he'd heard earlier. A pipe above the cabinets had burst. Probably a flood at the time, but now just a tiny leak, dropping pearls of dingy water onto the files below. Henry leaned forward and gently smacked his head against the cabinet. He used every swear in the book, but none of them made him feel better. So he sank to his knees and looked up at the room's skylight. The eye of God, always watching. As he peered upwards, he saw something move. A hand reached out across the skylight. Its finger tapped the pane, ever so gently. Another hand followed, and then another, until the moonlight disappeared and the room went pitch black. 'Cause now a swarm of hands and limbs were covering up God's eye. It was the pack of men, crawling on the ceiling. They'd entered silently, or maybe they'd been there the whole time, watching Henry, waiting, like a pile of vipers ready to strike. And strike they did. They crept down the walls of the room towards our guy. And Henry, well, he was frozen, shocked into immobility, because he'd just realized something we'd all guessed already. These men, they weren't just murderers. They were the undead, ghosts of the departed prisoners, ready to feast on the living. rough, wet hand suddenly grabbed his. When he looked to his side, he once again met those blue eyes. It was the same guy he'd seen in the mirror. The man's mouth hung open once more. He croaked, a dreadful, hair-raising sound. And then the man shoved Henry with all his might. The flashlight fell out of Henry's grip as he soared through the door. He skid on the concrete floor outside, wincing as his tailbone smashed into the hard surface. Back in the room, the flashlight had hit the ground and was spinning like a top. It periodically illuminated the faces of the dead, their haunted eyes, their gaping, rotten mouths. Henry struggled to his feet. This time, he had no light but the moon to guide him. But he knew it was a straight shot to the exit. He just had to get there fast. It felt like forever running down that corridor. The blackness pressed in on him. Every little sound sent his heart racing until he finally saw salvation. A strobe light from the event blinked in the distance. And then the music, that corny soundtrack of ghosts screaming. Terror behind the walls, so close. Then, a shadowy figure stepped into his path. It was joined by a few others. The inmates had assembled. Henry stopped. Tears pressed at the back of his eyes. He gazed up at the skylight yet again. The eye of God was watching and had found him lacking. There was nothing he could do about it now, other than mourn the fresh start he apparently didn't deserve. He wondered if his son would also grow up wondering what became of his good-for-nothing dad. Henry released the breath he'd been holding in, and then he closed his eyes and waited for his limbs to get rearranged by the unholy specters that stood in his path. Henry's eyes were still closed when he felt a frigid breeze on the back of his neck, followed by a broken, stammering whisper in his ear. It said,
"Go right."
Remember when I was going on about Henry's body and mind being at odds with one another? Well, in this case, that was a good thing, because before Henry could think, he listened to that voice, and he ran to the right. Up ahead was an opening in the floor, with steps leading down to a subterranean level. He flew down those steps and into the inky darkness below. Henry stopped as the cold of the earth around him made his breath catch. He couldn't see a thing. No moonlight here. No eye adjustment to be had. Just black. Even without being able to see, Henry suspected he knew what this was. The hole. A hellscape of cells that the guards would shove inmates into for solitary confinement. No light, no human contact, barely any food. So they wouldn't starve to death, but their brains would slowly blister and rot from isolation. Call me crazy, but that sounds worse than whatever the ghost did to that actor earlier. Henry reached a hand out, feeling around for some kind of exit. His fingertips touched a cold stone wall. It had marks on it, small indents or scratches. Each was about the width of a fingernail. Someone had been trying to get out. A knot formed in his stomach. Dread, 'cause of the nails and all. And yeah, 'cause of the darkness. But also, Henry had this feeling he wasn't alone. Then the whispers started, low at first all around him, then louder until there were shrieks in his ear. He felt someone push his back, hard. He lurched forward, throwing his hands out to stop his fall. His palm smacked into the wood. A door, no, a board, covering some kind of crawl space. Henry frantically moved it and lunged inside. He could feel fingers graze his ankles, trying to pull him back out, but he squirmed away. His nails dug into the earth around him and he pulled himself forward. He expected to hit some kind of end, but he didn't. He kept going, because it wasn't a crawl space. It was a tunnel. He almost laughed in relief. An escape tunnel. There were supposedly 30 of these, dug by prisoners. Only a few actually led outside. Henry hoped this was one of them. He continued to crawl for what felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. And then, his fingers grazed something hard, mealy, covered in dust and some other sticky substance. It was long, dense, but also fragile, like a bone. This thought startled Henry, and he flinched. His head hit the ceiling of the tunnel as he scrambled backwards, away from the thing he suspected was a human skeleton. As he did, a violent, bright beam of light blinked on, directly into his eyes. Henry threw up a hand to block it out. The light lowered slightly, until Henry could see who was behind it. When he did, he almost puked. It was the blue-eyed man. The ghosts had found him. But this solemn inmate didn't move. He didn't attack. Instead, he looked down at what lay on the tunnel floor. The thing Henry touched was, indeed, a decomposed corpse, wearing what was left of that prison-issued uniform the others had on. The tunnel dead-ended just in front of this inmate, but he'd clearly been digging his way out. Died from it, maybe. There was a bent spoon clasped in one hand, a broken shard of toilet porcelain in the other. Henry also noticed something peeking out of the dead prisoner's pocket, a piece of paper. The blue-eyed man croaked, nodded to the pocket. The paper. Henry grabbed it. When he saw what it was, his heart stopped. It was a photo of Henry as a child. This deceased, almost escapee was Henry's old man. Henry looked up at the blue-eyed inmate, and suddenly, he saw it. The reedy build, the bushy eyebrows, the eyes that were so much like Henry's own. Try to follow me here, because this was quite a thing. To stand over the shell of your dead dad, and at the same time look into the face of his ghost. It's not just a rarity, it's probably impossible. But here Henry was, experiencing it all the same. Not exactly the father-son reunion he'd imagined. As the two of them enjoyed their brief moment of impossibility, a wail echoed from the tunnel behind them. Another one followed. Then there was a scraping sound, like a series of nails clawing at dirt. The undead were on their way. His father smiled and nodded at his spoon and shard. He was clearly telling Henry to use them. And then he vanished, leaving Henry alone in a tunnel with a corpse and two pitiful digging instruments, while a horde of wretched inmates crept towards him. Henry stared at the end of the tunnel. Who knows how much dirt he had left before he broke through? What was the point in trying if he was just going to end up like his dad? Dead, alone, rotting, with a son that wouldn't even know what he looked like. But then he focused on his dad's body. The elder Gifford had been helping him, trying to ensure Henry got to leave this place. It's funny. This whole time he'd been looking at the sky, thinking God was the one who'd grant his redemption, when really it was his father who gave him the chance, and Henry wasn't gonna waste it. He plunged the spoon into the earth. The dry dirt crumbled easily. Henry hit it with the shard and crumbled even more. He sped up his assault, digging as hard as he could. Then he dropped the instruments and used his hands. The damned closed in. Screams got louder, and soon he felt their fingers tickle the bottom of his feet. Their hands crept up his shins, ready to pull him into the bowels of a hell he'd never return from. The night was breaking by the time I left the prison. After hours spent with ghouls and sadistic fantasy, the chilly air outside felt like a relief, like I'd been reborn. I was happy to turn my back on that place, to leave the horrors, however campy, behind me. But Eastern State Penitentiary wasn't finished with me yet. Soon as I rounded the corner of one of those fortified walls, I felt something cold and clammy grab my ankle. I'd like to say I stayed calm and collected, but I won't lie to you. I screamed, louder than I've ever shrieked since the time I encountered that cryptid in South Carolina. The fear bubbled up in my chest, and every muscle I had tensed up. When I peered down at what had grabbed me, I saw a face, looking up at me from an open street grate. It was that guard I'd noticed earlier, the nervous one who'd hurried off. He was wide-eyed, blood-streaked, covered in dirt. The first thing out of his mouth was an amazed, almost zen-like statement. I got out. I waited there with Henry for the ambulance to come, and he told me his tale. Even though he didn't say this outright, I could see it all over his face. He was ready to move forward, to get on the straight and narrow for his kid. The tunnel, his dad's body, had been about enough for him to finally understand. Second chances are important. Don't waste them. You might not get another one. In fact, it's amazing if you get one at all. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and produced by Abakar Adan and Lee Mengistu. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. Creature vocalization by Terry Cashburn and artwork by Jessica Clarkston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producers at Will Media are Will Malnati and Rosie Guerin. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.